Well, welcome back, everybody. We move straight on with this second session. I have the impression the speakers are keeping absolutely perfect time, where we very slightly exceeded ourselves over coffee. So we'll have to be better disciplined. Very warm welcome to our two speakers in person on either side of me, and I will introduce the third speaker who will speak second, who will be participating via Zoom. The first up in this session is Professor Aristeidis Hatζής, Professor of Philosophy of Law and Theory of Institutions at the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, or Kinos EKPA. His book, The Noblest Cause, the 1821 Greek War of Independence, I understand it's forthcoming in English. Many of us have already had the opportunity to read and admire it in the Greek edition, which came out, I think, just in time during the anniversary of 1821. The subject of Professor Hatζής' paper is, quote, the ornament of the House of Brunswick, the Duke of Sussex and his involvement in Greek affairs from 1817 to 1828. Υποθέτω όταν ακούμε Duke of Sussex, ο νους μας δεν πηγαίνει μονίμως στη ρεζέρβα. Κύριε Χατζή, έχετε το λόγο.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Professor Beaton. I'd like to express my gratitude to the British School of Athens and to the National Library of Greece for this great conference and the opportunity to present some of my research. But before I begin, I have the temptation to show to you something that it came up today. This morning, my son was assigned his role, his, let's say, part of the play that is going to be performed at the national holiday of March 25, celebrating the Greek Revolution. And I think that it is a good omen for our conference. Next to them, many Philhellenes are coming from Britain, from France, from Germany. They compete each other who is going to volunteer first for the Greek liberation, let's say. So, as I said, this is a good omen for the conference, and now I return to the Duke of Sussex, the first and the original Duke of Sussex. On February 21, 1824, the so-called Greek deputies, that is the two representatives of the Greek revolutionary government in London, signed the contract for the first foreign loan to the Greeks. The two deputies were Andreas Louriotis and Ioannis Orlandos, who had reached London in late January, and they were now happy to put their signatures at the paperwork. They were too eager to collaborate with the London Greek Committee, even though the very specific guidelines they received from Alexandros Mavrokordatos, who was essentially the Minister for Foreign Affairs when he wrote them, were rather difficult for them to understand and realize. Let's see these guidelines in some detail. It is only fair for Greece to profit from the antagonism between Russia and England by exploiting the English alarm for the possibility of Russian expansion. Make sure that the English are persuaded that we are not Russia's pawns, but on the contrary, our national independence will benefit geopolitically. He doesn't use the word geopolitically, but he uses analogous words. Both England and Europe, by undoing Russian scheming. Since the crumbling Ottoman Empire cannot serve anymore as a bulwark against Russian power, an independent Greece can successfully replace it. Make them see that England and Greece share the same interests. Keep in mind that it is not in Greece's interest to ally with England were only interested to establish a mutually beneficial commercial relation. But be careful, the English should not monopolize our trade. The third guideline. Your mandate is to negotiate a non-exclusionary trade agreement with England. You have a broad discretion, but keep in mind that any agreement should be approved by the Greek government, who has the final say, with the exception of the loan. We can accept financial help from England, but not military assistance under any circumstances. The only thing that we need now is money, nothing more. Regarding the broader political relations with England, you should first establish what are the real intentions and the motives of the English government concerning our independence. And please inform us. Try using the members of the London Greek Committee to gather the necessary information. The other great powers should not be alienated by your presence in England. You should take extra care to emphasize that your only mission in London is to negotiate a loan agreement, nothing more. Our best interest is an alliance with the United States of America. You must negotiate secretly with the American ambassadors in London and Paris and the American Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. You have the discretion to negotiate everything with the Americans, everything, as long as the outcome benefits Greece. You should even negotiate a loan agreement if you find better terms in the US. But be very careful. Nobody should suspect that we're negotiating with the Americans for anything more than a loan. As you can see, these guidelines were very sophisticated for the two inexperienced Greek deputies. So the only thing that they managed to achieve was to participate in some degree in the negotiation of the loan agreement, which was quite decent under the circumstances. The first loan has been heavily scrutinized by the Greek and non-Greek historians, who were mostly interested in the oppressive stipulated terms, the many obstacles to the disbursement of the first installment after Byron's death, the amount of money which actually reached the revolutionaries, the way the Greek government supposedly squandered the loan during the Civil War, etc. The role of the London Greek Committee was also scrutinized in the negotiation of the contract and the handling of the loan, and has also, this rather spurious role was also been stressed by the historians, but with an emphasis on the scandals, the conflicts between the Greek deputies and the London Greek Committee, the accusations against the Greek deputies for corruption and mismanagement. The political aspect of the first loan have not been analyzed so much. While several historians recognize the importance of the first loan as a signal for the involvement of Great Britain in the Greek affairs, I believe that the nature of this involvement, the political nature of this involvement, and the way that the loan contributed to this involvement and to a certain degree to a commitment of Greeks to Great Britain, has not been explored adequately in the bibliography. Several questions have not been answered, and some leads have not been followed. Let's take an example. Why did the Greek government, and Alexandros Mavrokordatos in particular, decide to cooperate with the members of the London Greek Committee, who were notorious in the British political scene and marginalized? They were, after all, a group of radicals who were suspected of subversive activities in England, but also in other European countries, most importantly, Spain. John Bowring, the mastermind behind the committee, was arrested and put to jail in France as a dangerous schemer, subversive. He was released a few days before the founding of the Greek Committee. I mentioned specifically Mavrokordatos because he had been the one who tried relentlessly in 1821 and 1822 to extricate the Greek Revolution from the radicalism and purge, at the same time, from the radicalism of the secret European societies. Why was he now ready to associate the Greeks with such infamous allies? As we saw, he advised the Greek deputies to cooperate with these dangerous radicals. Did the Greek leaders identify this fringe group with the British government? This is very unlikely. Did they identify the British radicals with George Canning? Certainly not. The approach to the group was suggested by the conservative Bishop Ignatius 2 months. And this is, I have just added this slide for the benefit of Dr. Grant after attending his. One of the persons of the Philhellenes who tried to warn Mavrocordatos about the dangers of associating as implicitly, as tacitly as he could was Thomas Gordon. So, the approach to this group was suggested by the conservative Bishop Ignatius 2 months before the appointment of Canning to the ministry, 1 week before Castlereagh's suicide. That, of course, it was, could not be predicted. Ignatius was a Russophile. He was literally a Russian agent. He calls himself a Russian agent. He was very well informed and he was very cautious. He even criticized the use of political terms that were reminiscent of the Athenian democracy by the revolutionary government. For example, the term Arios Pagos. He considered them politically perilous in the post-Napoleonic Europe. Nevertheless, Ignatius decided to approach these radicals himself, and he advised the Greek government to do the same. How wise it was for the Greeks to connect themselves with a radical opposition to the British government, to people who were loathed by Castlereagh, but also by every other court in Europe. The fact is that the Greeks decided to cooperate with these radicals, to let them, guide them, to trust them. One could say that all this was the result of desperation, of extreme financial strains. There is some truth to this, but there was also another factor. This fringe group, these radicals, were not as marginalized as they seemed. We now know that they were very close to George Canning, but I believe that there was more than that. Let's go back to the day of the signing of the contract. Normally, the contract would have been signed at this street, at the office of the small firm Laughnan, Son & O'Brien at 19 Coleman Street, with no more than a dozen people present. The Greek deputies, the London bankers, the trustees, that is, the members of the London Committee. One could expect a scene reminiscent of a Charles Dickens novel. In a small, crowded room, inside the dilapidated, dark building, the two Greek deputies, representing some desperate revolutionaries, are signing a contract under the dim light and the impatient, fleeting looks of the agents and the trustees. But this was not the case. The contract was signed at this building, with the 6 fluted Corinthian columns, the so-called Mansion House, the official residence of the Lord Mayor of London. The Lord Mayor himself was present at the signing of the contract that was organized as in a grand manner under his auspices. The loan had been announced to the public 2 days ago. So this was simply a political ceremony, a ceremony that had explicit political symbolism and also political repercussions. At the end of the formalities, a banquet was organized at the spectacular Egyptian hall of the Mansion House. More than 50 persons were invited at this grand dinner, as it was called by the mayor. Many members of the Greek committee were there. Some of them were also members of the House of Commons and of the House of Lords. There were foreign dignitaries, but not of the usual sort. That night, apart from the Greek deputies and the members of the Greek committee, Greek London Committee, several seasoned revolutionaries who were political exiles in London were present. One of them was Francisco Mina, the only Spanish general who successfully resisted the French invasion. Mina was accompanied by his aide-de-camp, the Argentine revolutionary and liberal politician Facundo Quiroga. My accent is terrible in any language, so. Miguel del Riego, a radical Spanish priest and a close associate of his brother Rafael, was also there. But the most important guest, the guest of honor of the Lord Mayor, was the Duke of Sussex, the brother of King George IV, and the sixth son of George III. The Duke of Sussex was the fifth or the sixth person in the British line of succession in 1824. Let us ponder for a while. The representatives of a revolutionary government that is not recognized by any European court have contracted a loan with the help of members of the British Parliament who participate in the negotiation on behalf of the Greeks and function as trustees. The loan was signed at a governmental building with the participation of elected officials and a member of the royal family. Apparently, there was much more than the loan into the bargain. And one wonders if this was only a display orchestrated by the members of the committee with the silent consent or even encouragement of George Canning, or if the radical Philhellenes were part of a broader network. I believe that both are true. Canning wished to indirectly endorse the loan, and the best way to do that was to use the London Greek Committee, which was not only a network of Philhellenes, radical and liberal politicians and intellectuals, but also Freemasons. These groups seemed marginalized, but they weren't. They had established powerful alliances, and they had a substantial political clout. Canning was essentially weaponizing them to achieve his goal of bringing the Greeks closer to him. The Greek deputies were overwhelmed. They were mesmerized. The way they were treated equal to an unofficial but symbolic recognition of the Greek revolutionary government by the British government or even the court. This is not an exaggeration. The Austrian diplomats in London sent all the details of the events to Metternich, who interpreted these events in the same way. For the Greek deputies, this was too much. They could not resist the allure of the first de facto international recognition by powerful members of the British elite. They could not adhere to Mavrokordatos' cautious warnings anymore. They went with the flow. The Duke of Sussex was known as the liberal prince, since from an early age, he had advocated consistently liberal and radical causes. He was, of course, an abolitionist. He supported a wider representation of the people and parliamentary reform. He defended oppressed minorities like the Catholics, the dissenters, and especially the Jews. He was married without the consent of his father, the king. He openly criticized the infringement of constitutional principles and rights in Britain. He was an active Freemason. He was the one responsible for the unification of the English lodges. In December 1813, he became the Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England. Now, a man like him had a lot of titles and positions, but one of them might be useful for our story. The Duke of Sussex was elected president of the Royal Society of Arts in February 1816. This was not an honorary appointment, it was a real election, the result of a real election. The newspapers presented it as an opposition triumph, a triumph that was organized very diligently by the Freemasons and the Radicals. The Royal Society of Arts was identified with the Freemasons. The appearance of the Duke of Sussex at a grand dinner, for the benefit of the Greeks, was not an isolated incident. The Lord Mayor was his political ally. He was elected with the help of the Duke of Sussex. The prince himself might have arranged the banquet with the help of his fellow radicals, the members of the Greek committee. Not only that, the Duke of Sussex invited the Greek deputies to his famous parties at Kensington Palace, and he added them to his entourage in numerous events where the Duke of Sussex was the honorary guest. He was accompanied by the Greek deputies and other revolutionaries, sometimes even at not political events, as the Fishmongers' Company Grand Dinner in early August of 1824, where the Duke gave a passionate speech in favor of the Mediterranean revolutions in general. Now, one wonders, what was Canning's reaction to such shenanigans? Apparently, Canning was more than okay, with the Duke of Sussex full endorsement of the Greeks. A year earlier, in the summer of 1823, Canning had received a desperate dispatch from Lord Strangford, the British ambassador to the Sublime Porte. In his dispatch to George Canning, dated July 16, 1823, Strangford informed the Minister of Foreign Affairs that Captain Edward Blacker, a representative of the London Committee, who was traveling in the Morea, collecting information and assessing the situation for the committee, but also for Canning, spread a preposterous rumor. According to Strangford's sources, the Irish Philhellene claimed that a promoter, a patron of the committee was a prince of the blood royal of England. Apparently, Strangford referred to the Duke of Sussex. Strangford tried to warn Canning that his policy had alienated the Ottomans and that the involvement of a member of the royal family gave a stamp of approval with immense political repercussions, negative, of course, according to Strangford. But Canning was happy with the result. He held an official policy of neutrality, but at the same time, he orchestrated the approach using the London Greek Committee as a tool and as a bait. The Greeks would fall inevitably on his lap. Let's go back to the Duke of Sussex. The idea of a British royal prince sponsoring a society of dissenters, liberals, radicals, and libertines did not sound as preposterous to someone familiar with British politics of the time and the liberal ideas of the prince, who had strong ties with radical politicians such as the legendary... I don't have any more... Oh, okay, I'll try my best to sum up. He was called by the legendary radical Francis Burdett, who was the one who titled the Duke the ornament of the House of Brunswick. There is an abundance of evidence of his behind-the-scenes involvement in the Greek affairs from 1823 to the election of Prince Leopold for the throne of Greece. When Colonel Stanhope, returning to London with Byron's remains after his Greek adventure, the Duke of Sussex, together with the Greek deputies, the radicals, and the revolutionaries, participated in the long procession that left London on July 12 and travelled 130 miles to the north to Nottinghamshire for the burial service. Stanhope, who was the real commissar of the London Committee to Greece and a staunch Republican, thought that the Duke of Sussex could be a possible candidate for the throne of Greece. Alerino Palma gives us further evidence that the members of the Greek Committee might have planned the Duke of Sussex ascendance to the Greek throne as early as the summer of 1823. This was not a secret. The British press, even the literary magazines, suggested openly his name as the most probable candidate for the Greek throne, but he was not destined to be the first king of the Greeks. On September 19, 1825, a meeting took place at the Foreign Office between George Canning and the three Greek deputies, Louriotis, Orlandos, and Spaniolakis. According to the confidential minutes of that meeting, the Greek deputies declared that they wished to have a king from the royal family of England. And the name of Duke of Sussex was, of course, mentioned. There are at least three reasons for the Duke of Sussex's failure to be selected for the Greek throne. First, the fact that he was a member of the British royal family and the brother of the king, the other great powers wouldn't have it. Second, the strong wish by a part of the British court and the government to get rid of Prince Leopold and his influence on some members of the royal family. And third, the possible lack of interest by the Duke himself due to his ill health. He had a chronic asthma, or his possible dislike for the prospect. I have not found any evidence of a possible Duke of Sussex involvement in the Greek affairs after 1825. The Duke of Sussex was one of the most popular royals in the British history. He was the favorite uncle of Queen Victoria, and she chose him to give her away at her wedding to Prince Albert in 1840. When Victoria became queen, his position at the royal court was suddenly upgraded. He had a prominent position in the royal council, and he was always one of her most progressive advisors. He died in early 1843, and he was not interred with the royal family at Windsor because in his will he declared that he did not want a state funeral and that he wished to be buried in the public cemetery at Kensal Green. When he died, the London Times commented that no death in the royal family, short of the actual demise of a monarch, could have occasioned a stronger feeling of deprivation. Now, the involvement of the Duke of Sussex in the Greek affairs seems rather short and opportunistic, but I believe that this is not so. I have found scattered evidence of his circle discussing plans for the liberation of Greece as early as 1817. Members of his circle, mostly Freemasons like Charles Monk, have been involved in the Parga affair. Parga affair. That is the sale of Parga to Ali Pasha. Charles Monk and James Makidos were the members of parliament who pressured relentlessly the British government, especially Castlereagh, informed the public opinion, and even represented the interest of the people of Parga in assessing the compensation. The circle demanded openly the political independence of the Ionian Islands. They regularly accused the British government that they treated the islands as a colony, and they criticized Maitland severely. There are some clues that the Duke of Sussex was involved in plans for the liberation of Greece with the Ionian Islands as a bridgehead as early as 1817. This is one of the editorials published in that period by some members of his circle in a Freemason journal, newspaper. The editorials usually do not have a signature. This is a front-page editorial published by The Sun, a newspaper that was affiliated, as I said, with the Freemasons. Strangely enough, this editorial has a signature, RSA. As you can see, the word that the writer has used is independence. He discusses the future independence of Greece in an article about the Parga affair. 6 years later, John Bowring will be arrested by the French authorities as a possible accomplice to a French military group, a former Napoleon military officers who tried to subvert the French government in early 1821. In their trial, it was revealed that the password they used was Parga, Greece. The French suspected that Bowring was the liaison between French officers like Charles Nicolas Favier and the circle of the Duke of Sussex. But this is a very far-fetched hypothesis and a work in progress. Thank you. And I'm very sorry for the abuse of time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Aristivas. That was absolutely fascinating and brought Philhellenism into rather higher quarters in the UK than I think many of us had ever really suspected. Thank you so much for that. Now, for our second, we move straight on. The discussion will be at the end of the session. So we move now to the internet participation by Professor Γκέκας. Do we have Professor Γκέκας on the screen? Is it possible to get that on this screen here? No? Okay. Sakis, can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Hello, Sakis. 2 minutes, I have to look the other way, I'm afraid, but I will introduce you and then you have 20 minutes, please.
Thank you.
So you can see him, but I can't. Sάκης Γκέκας is Associate Professor and the Hellenic Heritage Foundation Chair in Modern Greek History at York University, Toronto. He works on British colonialism and state formation in Greece, on the history of the Greek Revolution of 1821, and the history of Greeks in Canada. He's published several books on aspects related to those subjects, most recently Xenocracy, State, Class and Colonialism in the Ionian Islands, 1815 to 1864. So I hand over now to Sakis Γκέκας, who will speak to us on the subject of, quote, neutrality does not bother me, end of quote, Charles Napier, Philhellenism as colonial benevolence, and the Ionian Islands during the Revolution. Sakis, over to you.
Thank you very much. Many thanks to the organizing committee of the British School, and I'm sorry I could not be with you during this wonderful conference. In many ways, Professor Hadzis talked earlier served as a great introduction to what I'm going to be talking about. In July 1820, Charles James Napier returned from his journey to Ioannina and his visit to Ali Pasha, and he wrote that he was looking to rebel against the Sultan and that he was only looking to enlist men, and that if England did not support Ali, Russia or Austria would do so. Napier's suggestion was that England could make Ali, quote, an independent sovereign, not only of Albania, but all Greece, from the Morea to Macedon, end of quote. Almost prophetically, Napier sketched out his rough plan of international relations with Greece as a proxy state. Quote, but if ever England engages in war with Russia to support the Turks, the Greeks will consider her as trying to rivet their chains and will join the Russians. Indeed, the Grand Signior may be called now the lieutenant of the Emperor Alexander in Greece, while Ali is de facto an independent sovereign and a Greek, and is looked up by the Greeks as the greatest man of their country. We may use Greece against Alexander as we did Portugal against Bonaparte, but with far more power and without expense. In some ways, the individual I'm going to be talking about serves as one of the earlier highlighted Philhellenes, but one of the sort of more ignored in recent accounts of the Greek Revolution. So I'm not going to talk much about the Ionian Islands and the context in which the revolution relates to them. I'm just going to say that this is a British imperial context of ambitions, plans, and policies in the Mediterranean that bespeak of a shifting British policy during the Greek Revolution, and also reveal Napier's personal motivations and ambitions, evoking his confidence, but also reflecting his position in the Ionian Islands during the 1820s. Robert Holland, among others, I think he's the most outspoken historian on this matter at least, that the most reliable information, as he said, about the fluctuating struggle of the 1820s was always culled from correspondence intercepted by the Ionian authorities, which was why the British government always knew more about what was happening than other European governments. It is those statements that I think make us more aware of the central role that the Ionian Islands played during the Greek Revolution, not only geographically or politically as a state that is a protectorate and therefore is on the border and on the front line in many ways of British policy vis-à-vis the Ottoman Empire, but it is also one of the most interesting ones precisely because it tested the limits of neutrality that was of the official policy, and also reveals the dissension in the Ionian Islands between Napier, Maitland, and more broadly official, let's say, British policy, as David Wrigley has identified since 1975. So what I'm saying is that there is an early recognition of Napier's central role that has kind of been abandoned in recent interpretations of the Greek Revolution. This is a shifting ground, as Professor Hadzis also alluded to earlier, and as many others have said. I'm just not going to spend too much time on this. I'm just going to say that there is a transition from the earlier, more strict consider attitude by among others, High Commissioner Maitland, who also had a more pragmatic approach, and he's often been seen, and I have agreed on that conclusion, that he had a more pragmatic approach vis-à-vis his also very strict approach to the attempts to stop Ionians from crossing to the Ionian Sea to join the revolution. In reality, the Ionian Islands were a lot more accommodating to the Greek Revolution, not only because of the geographical proximity, since at least the 1800s, 1810s, that they served as a training ground of many Greek fighters in the revolution, but also organizationally before, especially, but also during the revolution, as the members of the ουδετερότητα who were from the Ionian Islands and their work testifies. The stories of Ionian volunteers, the accommodation and the protection that the Ionian Islands offered to refugees, especially in the islets of Kalamos and Kastos, are also well known or have become more known. And of course, no other than Kapodistra himself is, as is fairly well known, important for his training as a Ionian statesman, very early years of 1800s, prepared him in some respects also for what he would face later on in Greece. So we're moving from a position of non-neutrality and the first execution of 5 Ionian pirates, as it was called, in 1821, to a policy of imposing a truce by 1825, 1826, with, of course, in the meantime, having local diplomacy playing a major role, as the documents that are to be found in the Colonial Office in London testify, the bound volumes named, in fact, the Greek Revolution, that historians, still have to make some use of. I also want to mention that in the context of this conference and also the broader discussion, historiographical, the Ionian Islands form probably an exception to the crisis of sovereignty of the 1820s. Maurizio Isabella's explanation that may be more relevant and appropriate to use when it talks to monarchical authority, particularly in the case of Sicily and in the 1820s Samos, but when it comes to the Ionian Islands, this crisis of sovereignty came much later in the 1850s. And the reason I mention this is because during the revolution, many Ionians and the Ionian state as a whole benefited and in some cases profited from the War of Independence, be it from the current exports that saw booming years in the late 1820s especially, and related to that, the increased state revenue that came with it. It is also something that specialists on shipping and commerce will, I think, confirm in this symposium, in this conference, and that's what historiography concludes recently. Well, if anything, loyalty was reaffirmed during the 1820s. There will be another decade because before British rule was challenged by liberal politicians such as Andreas Mustoxidis, and in fact with the uprisings of 1848-49 and later on with the political crisis of 1850s. So in the 1820s, there is no crisis of sovereignty in the Ionian Islands. What there is, however, is the ground of control of Kefalonia, the personal affinities, experiences before the revolution, and why some Philhellenism mobilized and what they did in revolutionary Greece and how effective it was were some of the key questions of the conference call. And the way I want to highlight all these elements above in the first point is that Charles James Napier forms this sort of archetypical Philhellene imperial agent who, has an illustrious career that earned him not only a biography recently, which saves me from the temptation to try and write one, but also his statue in Trafalgar Square. So while 1820s Napier, what does he do? He is the governor of Kefalonia, or resident as he's called officially, and he writes as well as builds. This is to the right, you can see, to your right, you can see images of Lixouri and Argostoli, buildings that were destroyed in the 1953 earthquake. And to the left, you can see one of his major writings, the second on anonymously published, but people knew who he was, Greece in 1824, something that Miller, the American Philhellene, read in 1827 and said that this was probably one of the missed opportunities of the Greeks of gaining a leader, a military commander that was worthy of their cause. In some ways, his most known work, however, is the Memoir on the Roads of Kefalonia, an unusual sort of work that is testament to his construction major construction wars during the 1820s, as the book attests. So he's a committed imperialist, but that he's serving under a civilizing project. And he's, as I said at the start, he goes with to Yanna 4 times, 2.5 years. And when he's appointed military resident, his writings and his conduct in general reveal that he has two one could even consider them opposing sides. One is his views about the natives, as he calls them. He feels for them, especially the lower classes, but also he despises the elites, of the elite of Kefalonia, and also of of the Greeks of later on, of their military commanders. So therefore, one must distinguish his ideas about the Greek Revolution and his own ambition to rule effectively from general ideas about the natives and those who he considered unworthy. His concerns were mostly the administration of justice, which he presided over since the day he took over, and especially with the construction of roads that was disgraceful to civilization. So whether it was building roads or liberating the Greeks, his civilizational, his civilizing project is central to his understanding of Greece and I think the world more broadly. His many achievements include, as is seen here, the interview he ended up having with the London Committee about taking over, something that did not go through. And nonetheless, as I mentioned in the introduction, he has plans and he has preferences when it comes to individuals as well. As he said, with the exception of the glorious defense of Missolonghi by Prince Mavrocordato and a few naval exploits, everything done by the Greek chiefs has been a mass of confusion, of ignorance, of blundering beyond all conception. So he's perhaps, as a little bit, I think, deservedly, Sinclair has called him a self-proclaimed expert in Greece. I think pretty much everyone at the time is a self-proclaimed expert, more or less. But he's also taking clear sides with Mavrocordato, and Mavrocordato takes with him. We know that he's often consulted Napier on the government of Greece, as Napier mentioned, and his military strategy and imperial plans are most evident in his War in Greece work that I don't want to read too many extracts from, but it is sort of a long essay pamphlet of about 30-35 pages that includes this map at the end that is testament to Napier's sort of grand idea of how Greece could be independent but serve as a proxy state, just almost as the Duke of Sussex that Professor Hatζής mentioned earlier. I want to finish with a comment on the ethnic Philhellenism that some of these people may or may not have. Napier, of course, an Irishman, is a testament also, and I am very keen to understand this aspect of his role as well, is part of this reconsideration of British Philhellenism that led to the construction of a movement, as it was even called, but also perception of altruism by many historians of the previous century, that also saw Philhellenes as British romantics. And I think I've convinced you that Napier is not one of them, as his future career as governor of Sindh, conqueror and governor of Sindh in present-day Pakistan testifies. This is perhaps an Irish benevolent imperialist Philhellene who is only one of several military officers, such as the Kennedys, doctor and officer in Kefalonia, Fitzroy, resident of Zakynthos, also Irish, Richard Church and Blanquer in Greece, Belfast-born James Emerson, and Nugent later on, or Hudson Lowe from Galway, who was also with Richard Church in the takeover of Zande. But what does it mean, actually, that is there anything particularly Irish about the Philhellenes, or is it still accurate to call them British because they also actually served the British Empire? And as Napier said when he welcomed and accommodated, I think, Raybaud in 1922, he said, officer to officer, you will understand that I cannot offer you a safe passage to Italy or France, but I can give you all the support you need. He says, I'm still an officer of the British Crown, and this was still 1822, so early days of the neutrality. Finally, I think we can safely conclude that the imperial term, the impact of empire on historians' perception of the involvement of foreigners in the Greek Revolution, is definitely on the table. People like Napier elements or individuals that show how colonial benevolence, the search for justice, stability, order, and also hegemony in the empire was really central in the minds of those people. And we can also see that beyond the Philhellenism of Napier and the anti-Philhellenism of Maitland, the role of empire and the Ionian Islands before, but also during the 1821 revolution was really central in more ways than people have actually testified so far. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sakis, both for that exemplary, in fact, slightly excessive, almost timekeeping. You're actually within the limit, and for that marvelous, lucid, and persuasive presentation. We're really meeting some interesting characters as Philhellenes in this session, are we not? So let's move on now to our third panelist, Paul Stock. Paul is Associate Professor of Early Modern International History at the London School of Economics and Political Science, better known as perhaps as LSE. His books include Europe and the British Geographical Imagination, 1760 to 1830, and the Shelley-Byron Circle and the Idea of Europe. And he's particularly engaged with the subject of this conference in a paper that he published in 2013 entitled The Real and Imagined Spaces of Philhellenic Travel. That was published in the European Review of History. So I'll hand over now to Paul Stock, whose subject is on the screen behind me, so I don't need to read it out. You have 20 minutes, Paul.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks also for inviting me to be here today. In this paper, I want to talk about popular British ideas about Greece in the late 18th and the early 19th century. And most of my discussion is going to be about what those ideas were and where we can identify them. The source base for this is pretty extensive, and I think we can speak with a reasonable degree of confidence about how Greece was perceived in the popular imagination of Britain of this period. How this relates to Philhellenism as an intellectual movement is a little bit more speculative, and part of my purpose in this paper is to present some proposals really for wider consideration. To discover widespread or popular ideas about Greece, I think we need to examine materials which were widely consumed in late 18th and early 19th century literate culture. And in much of my recent work, I've focused on British geographical books. There's a picture of my most recent book on the screen, if I can be permitted that moment of shameless self-publicity. Now, geographical books are a very large and a very distinct category of published writing, which includes gazetteers, geographical encyclopedias, standard reference works, and school books. They're the 18th century equivalent of school textbooks, coffee table books, encyclopedias, those sorts of things. And if it's helpful, I think it's sometimes worth thinking about these things as sort of the 18th century equivalent of something like Wikipedia. They're the sources to which most people would turn if they wanted geographical information quickly. So these texts were widely read, they were widely disseminated in British society, and they were read at every social level, from literate labourers right through to monarchs. In fact, we have very clear records of Queen Victoria reading these things in her childhood. And crucially, what they seek to do is they seek to collate common knowledge for widespread consumption by lots of people. They're popular texts, they're summative texts that they set out to gather commonplace, everyday information, and that means that we can use them, I think, to uncover what people were thinking broadly in the period in which they were written. Now, in total, I've examined about 350 of these books. Some of them are very short, some of them are very, very long. And there are there are lots of different kinds of materials in these books, but some of them were produced in multiple editions as well. So the most popular ones were reprinted of upwards of 20 times in, say, a 50-year period. And these are the sorts of books I'm talking about. Some example title pages there of the kinds of books that these include. With a few exceptions, they've been almost completely neglected by intellectual and cultural historians. Partly that's because there's a lot of them, and few people are perhaps mad enough as me to try to read as many as I have. But they also got a lot of methodological difficulties in working with these materials because they're often anonymous or pseudonymous. They have misleading edition numbers, they've got fake authorship claims, they have missing publication details, they very rarely cite their sources with very accuracy, they are extraordinarily repetitious, and they chronically plagiarise one another as well. So this obviously creates a lot of problems for working with these materials and working out where the ideas have come from, amongst other things. But the more I read them, the more I realised that their repetitiousness, their propensity to republish and plagiarise the same material over and over again is actually an advantage for the kind of analysis that I want to do, because through familiar, repeated use of certain arguments and rhetorical devices, they set out established frameworks and terminologies for understanding geographical concepts. In short, what they allow us to do is they allow us to perceive the widely held and conventional ideas of a period. And reading them in bulk, because I think enabled me to recover some of the commonplace ideas that were circulating in 18th and 19th century Britain. So to get to my main point then, how do these books present and understand Greece? To summarise, and this is really a kind of summary of the whole argument, many books identify Greece as Europe's cultural point of origin, and some even argue that it actually epitomises Europe's advantages and achievements. But its incorporation within the Ottoman Empire causes significant complications and often prompts furious admonitions of Ottoman barbarity and its supposed corruption of Greece. And importantly, I think for our purposes here, this latter trend becomes particularly fervent after 1821. So Greece ends up occupying a very equivocal position in the British geographical imagination, simultaneously celebrated and decried. And in some cases, this blurred perspective is so severe that the geographical texts have difficulty distinguishing between modern Greece and the Ottoman Empire at all. They become so blurred that the texts often talk about Greece and Ottoman Empire in a rather confused fashion. To summarise, that argument is one thing, but I now want to explore some of the detail. And to begin with the first of the points I've mentioned. For a great many of these geographical works, Greece holds a special place in global and European history, predominantly thanks to its ancient classical past, of course. So just sort of odd quotations taken from these books. In some text, it's described as the point of origin for the progress of government, arts and manners. For another, it's considered the native country of the entire human race. Some texts are a bit more specific and regard ancient Greece as the foundation of European knowledge and civilization. And it's to the Greeks, says another book, that we may attribute much of our knowledge of the arts, sciences, and literature. Frequently, the region is seen as a synecdoche for all of Europe. What Greece, therefore, is with regard to Europe, Europe itself is with regard to the rest of the globe. And what that means effectively is that Greece is a microcosm of Europe. Its preeminence within the continent parallels and epitomises Europe's comparable supremacy over the rest of the world. Now that last sentiment is actually an adaptation of the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers David Hume's an idea that he first put forward. And it becomes repeated in so many of these books that it becomes almost a sort of mantra for understanding the region. These sorts of eulogistic accounts are very familiar, I think, to most of us here. But what complicates them significantly more is that the fact that Greece is incorporated within the Ottoman Empire in much of the period that I'm discussing. From at least the mid-16th century onwards, it had become quite commonplace to treat Greece both as a point of origin for Europe and the world, and to proclaim at the same time somehow its non-Western, different and exceptional status. And this tension finds various forms of popular expression in geographical texts. Some of them actually take a largely positive view of the Ottoman Empire, arguing that it has many benevolent, liberal, temperate, conversible and ingenious people, and that the Turks apparently excel all the rest of the mankind in compassion and love towards their neighbours. So those perspectives are trying to refute common cliches about the Ottomans as being aggressive and threatening. And neither, some of those sources say, is the state an untrammelled tyranny of rumour. And in fact, apparently, the Sultan is restrained by the laws of the Quran and a religious aristocracy in the same way that European monarchs are, at least in theory, restrained by law and Christian morality. For some texts, in fact, the Ottoman Empire is unquestionably a part of Europe itself, or at the very least a kind of bridging state which connects it with Asia. And so hence in the New Geographical Atlas, which was a book published in 1721, actually before the period that I'm talking about primarily, the Ottoman Empire is described as one of the three noblest and renowned empires in the world, which make Europe remarkable, the others being Germany and Muscovy. For numerous texts, in fact, it's the presence of Greece, particularly, which confirms Europe's supposed European status. So in 1796, the new and complete system of universal geography's entry on Turkey in Europe is dominated by Greece. Roughly a third of the text covers the Greek islands. So in the whole of the article on the Ottoman Empire, I mean, it's something between 30 and 40% is actually about Greece. And for Isaac Payne's Introduction to Geography, published in 1809, it's the possession of Greece which makes the Ottoman Empire European. Only since the conquest of Greece has the Turks been considered a European power, that particular book says. So in those instances, Greece serves to bolster the Ottoman Empire's credibility as a European state. But increasingly, as we move forward in time looking at these books, geographical texts start to denigrate the Ottoman Empire and hold it responsible for Greece's apparent decline from classical glory. The arguments here are again very familiar, I think, to most of us here. There's talk of the incursion of barbarism and of slavery and degradation, of indolence and luxury, superstitious notions, customs, etc., all of which have served to degrade Greece as a country. And some argue even that it is not part of Europe at all by this point. According to John Bigland's Geographical and Historical View of the World in 1810, the Turks, although settled in Europe, are in fact Asiatic people, and their customs and manners are Asiatic rather than European. And there's a number of other arguments that these texts pursue. One, in fact, argues somewhat kind of oddly that the police of the Turkish government prevents communication between European nations and Asiatic cities. So those texts are arguing actually there's a very strong dividing line between the Ottoman Empire and the rest of Europe. I think we can see even from this summary of these remarks is that the Ottoman Empire occupies, by this point, a very equivocal position in geographical books. In some respects it's part of Europe, in some respects it isn't. And the geographical books often oscillate between those two positions quite haphazardly. But my principal point is that this also creates problems for Greece, which then becomes seen simultaneously as part of a celebrated classical tradition and, at the same time, as part of a dysfunctional state. And this is the central intellectual dilemma which geographical books face, and one which I think speaks to wider ambiguities in British cultural understandings of Greece. How can it be, at the same time, at the very centre of Europe's self-image, and also incorporated in an alien and supposedly inferior state? Now, geography books deal with this problem in different ways. Some of them claim that Greeks and Turks live intermixed, and the close connection between the peoples have caused them to have shared characteristics. And this is an approach which tries to play down the difference between Greece and the Ottoman Empire and deals with the problem of Greece's double status by presenting it as being thoroughly absorbed into the empire. That's one way of dealing with this tension. Other books take a completely different approach, and they suggest that the distinction between Greeks and Turks is so absolute that they have entirely separate historical narratives. Greeks and Ottomans are totally distinct people, and that's an approach which denies almost that those peoples and those states have anything to do with one another at all. But the approach which interests me the most, and I think which is probably the one that's most relevant for the concerns of this conference, is one which seeks to explain Greece's dual status by a reference to its supposed degeneration from former glories and corruption by the Ottomans. And this is certainly a commonplace perspective by the mid-18th century. So from Brooke's General Gazetteer, which was published in 1762, this book says that Greece groans under the tyranny of the Turks and is a shadow of what it was formerly, being overrun with ignorance, and all of the fine towns being destroyed. Other 18th century texts comment on how Greece is the most celebrated country in the world, and it's now oppressed and disheartened by a cruel and barbarous yoke. Again, very familiar concepts for most of us, I'm sure. But what's interesting is that these books, these arguments, gather a lot of rhetorical strength in the early 19th century, and particularly after 1821. And it's interesting, I think, to notice the gradual creep of overtly Philhellenic sentiments into these books. So books that were published in the 1810s start describing Turkey as a recent sovereignty, as if the centuries-long history of the Ottoman Empire in the region is merely a kind of temporary usurpation. Others provide very detailed accounts of previous Greek rebellions and use them to draw rather thinly veiled conclusions about current affairs. So early 19th century texts show a lot of interest, for example, in the failed insurgency of 1770. And there's also sympathy for Greeks who were induced to rebel by Russian agitators and were then ravaged with impunity, that's a quotation, by vengeful Ottomans. Now, these narratives clearly serve Philhellenic purposes. They show the oppression of the Greeks, but also their rebellious initiative and, crucially, their susceptibility to outside influence. And in fact, increasingly, these books become explicit calls to arms. So one of the geography books says of the 1770 uprising that Europeans who had formerly trembled to meet the armies of Turkey now begin to consider them as adversaries. We can quite clearly see here about some of these statements about how geographical books are becoming party to Philhellenic agendas and arguments. Now, all of this is building up to 2 points, perhaps one a little more obvious than another. First, I think the geography books give us an insight into the dissemination of Philhellenic ideas. These are not specialist texts, they're reference books. They're meant for people to look up points of general knowledge. And the fact that Philhellenic sentiments are present in these materials, in some cases in quite an early stage, suggests that those ideas are gradually seeping into the public consciousness in Britain, to the point where the study of geographical knowledge could incorporate politically motivated commentary about events in Greece. We can see here, I think, the chronological depth of some of these ideas, which prefigure later Philhellenic notions about Ottoman oppression of the Greeks. This is the seedbed of ideas which underpinned the more explicit movements at the turn of the century. Now, that perhaps is rather unsurprising. I mean, all of us here know that Philhellenic ideas have a long history, although perhaps not that they were quite so publicly displayed as in books like this. But I also wonder whether the geography text can help us to understand why those Philhellenic ideas took hold so strongly. It's true to say that some of these books present quite schematic understandings of Greece as an unambiguous victim of tyranny. But it's more common that the books show fundamental ambiguities about the presentation of Greece as being widespread in the British geographical imagination. It's both the cultural foundation stone of Renaissance Europe and an inaccessible otherly country which is marked by orientalised difference. And one of the things I wonder is whether the rising tide of Philhellenism provided a potential solution to the long-standing intellectual problem of how to conceptualise Greece in British culture. Increasing interest in Philhellenism, driven by emergent ideas about the nation-state and the related history of ethnic groups, allowed Greece to be understood more straightforwardly in terms of invasion, oppression and corruption. It allowed the tensions, the ambiguities and the uncertainties of Greece's liminal status to be simplified into a narrative of degradation and potential liberation. And this may partly explain the intellectual appeal of Philhellenism in late 18th, early 19th century Britain, because it took a long-standing intellectual problem about how to reconcile the supposed familiarity and the strangeness of Greece and resolved it into a more readily comprehensible description of an original foundational Greece corrupted into something deplorable. And better still, of course, it didn't just offer a theoretical solution, because, as we all know, Philhellenism would eventually provide a practical solution which could be actualised with time, money and arms. Greece could be made anew, its legacy and its modern potential divorced from non-European influence. And in the context of long-running complexities about Greece's status, the attractiveness of this formula can be easily understood, I think. So did the increasing popularity of Philhellenic ideas result in a new, less ambiguous understanding of Greece in popular geographical works? Not necessarily. In some cases, deep-seated uncertainties remain. So according to William Pinnock's Comprehensive Grammar of Modern Geography, which was published quite late in the period I'm interested in 1834, he says that Greece has long been blotted from the map of Europe following its complete absorption by the empire, which is quite a strange thing to argue, really, in 1834. Confusingly, the discussion in his book is then spread over 4 different chapters. So there's one on Turkey and Greece, there's 2 on European Turkey, and another one on the Grecian part of the Turkish Empire, or Greece. That latter chapter then repeatedly insists on the distinctive qualities of the Greeks, who maintain a dialect of their language and the levity and sprightliness of their ancestors. So in that book, Greece is thus completely distinct from, and at the same time fully absorbed into the Ottoman Empire, which is the resurgence of the familiar problem that I'm suggesting has long been a part of British thinking about Greece. So in this respect, I don't think we should see the increasing presence of Philhellenic sentiment in geographical material as marking the end of long-standing complications about Greece in British culture. It continues as both the heart of European self-identity and as a disturbingly unfamiliar environment. But my hypothesis is that the intense interest in Philhellenic ideas in Britain of this period is in part fuelled by a desire to resolve the ambiguities and marginality of Greece in British popular culture. And the extent of that marginality and of emergent Philhellenic ideas can be glimpsed from popular geographical books, books which seek to present conventional knowledge and thus afford a significant insight into popular mentalities. Thank you very much for listening.